Somewhere in Northern California in May of 1977, a young woman stepped into a blue Dodge Colt. She smiled politely at the couple inside. A man, a woman, a baby in the back seat. It felt safe. It would be 7 years before she would be free again. And by then, she would no longer be the same person. This is the story of Colleen Stan, the girl who vanished without ever leaving the house. Colleen Stan was 20 years old, bright, independent, and a little adventurous. She was hitchhiking from her home in Eugene, Oregon, to a friend's birthday in Northern California. She'd done it before. Back in the 70s, hitchhiking wasn't unusual. Dangerous, yes, but common. Colleen had a good sense about people. She'd already turned down 2 rides that morning. Something hadn't felt right. And then around Red Bluff, a small town in the middle of nowhere, a car pulled up. A young couple. Clean. Friendly. And they had a baby. Colleen's guard dropped. She got in. Their names were Cameron and Janice Hooker. He was tall, thin, polite. She was quiet, shy, holding their baby girl in the back seat. They asked her about her trip, her life. She relaxed. They even stopped at a gas station. Colleen went inside to use the restroom. She could have left then. She almost did. But something told her not to be rude. She got back in the car. That decision, that small moment of politeness, would become the pivot of her life. Cameron said they wanted to take a detour to see a scenic waterfall. Colleen nodded. She liked nature. The road grew quieter. Trees closed in. Then Cameron pulled over. Something changed in the air. The baby was gone. So was Janice. Colleen's smile faded. That's when Cameron pulled out a knife. He forced her to lie down. And then, from the trunk, he pulled out a strange wooden box shaped like a coffin for the head. He placed it over her. A box, just big enough to enclose her head and neck, lined with foam, airtight, soundproof. She was plunged into darkness, trapped, alone, breathing hot air, heart pounding. They drove 4 hours. When the box was finally removed, Colleen was in a cold, dark basement. Her arms were chained, her feet bound. She had no idea where she was. Cameron Hooker introduced himself again, but now not as a man. He said he was her master. And she? She was his slave now. He told her about an organization called the Company. They monitored slaves. They had eyes everywhere. If she tried to escape, they would kill her and her entire family. It was a lie. But how could she have known? Her world was now 4 walls, a ceiling, and sometimes a box. That box, the one from the trunk, became her prison. Cameron built a larger version designed to fit under their waterbed. It was just 3 feet tall. Colleen couldn't sit up, couldn't turn, couldn't scream, couldn't breathe properly. She stayed in that box, up to 23 hours a day, for 7 years, only let out to be fed or worse. Cameron Hooker wasn't just violent, he was methodical. He used psychological terror. He used hope as a weapon. Sometimes he let her read. Sometimes he talked kindly. Sometimes he took her outside in chains. He convinced her that freedom didn't exist anymore. He broke her without touching her, until Colleen no longer believed escape was possible. Even when the door was unlocked, Janice Hooker, the quiet wife, watched it all. She let it happen. Why? Because she believed she had no choice. Because she was once Cameron's prisoner too. He had married her as a teenager, groomed her into silence. He promised her that after Colleen, they would find another girl. And then another. A chain of obedience, passed down, hidden behind the walls of a normal house in a normal neighborhood. Here's the most disturbing part. 3 years into her captivity, Cameron let Colleen visit her family. Alone. He took her on a bus. She hugged her mother, smiled in family photos. She told them she had joined a religious group and couldn't talk about it. Her mother believed her because she looked fine. Too fine. Brainwashed. And after the visit, Colleen went back. Cameron had drawn up a slave contract. Colleen signed it. She believed it was legally binding. He hung her by her wrists for hours, suspended by meat hooks in the ceiling. He whipped her, electrocuted her, starved her, and still she obeyed. Because she thought the company was watching. Because she believed this was her fate. But the mind can only break so far. And deep inside Colleen, buried under years of silence, fear, and obedience, a spark was still alive. A question began to form. What if the company isn't real? What if this can end? The illusion was starting to crack. And Cameron Hooker? He was already preparing for the next girl. Colleen just didn't know it yet. Imagine being buried alive, not in dirt, but in silence. In a coffin you can't move in. Under someone's bed. For hours. For days. For years. This wasn't fiction. This was Colleen Stan's life. And what lay beneath that waterbed in a quiet California home was a prison built with wood, steel, and something far more dangerous. Control. Cameron Hooker wasn't just a sadist. He was a builder, a craftsman of horror. In the basement of his Red Bluff home, he drew up detailed blueprints, not for a house or a shed, but for a confinement box. A coffin-sized container lined with insulation and padding. It had a ventilation tube, barely enough airflow to survive. It locked from the outside. It muffled screams. And he slid it under his bed where he and Janice slept. While they dreamed above. Colleen couldn't even sit up. The longest stretch Colleen was ever in the box? 23 hours a day for more than 3 years straight. She couldn't tell time. There were no windows, no clocks, no way to know night from day. Only sound. Footsteps. The groan of a mattress. The baby crying. Colleen said the silence was worse than the pain. Worse than the hunger. Worse than the chains. Silence made her forget who she was. That's what Cameron wanted. Cameron's control wasn't just physical, it was ritualized. He made Colleen perform acts of obedience. Stand in poses. Recite phrases. He used the company as a leash. He claimed they were watching. That they owned her. That they had spies in town and even inside her family. He forged fake documents, company letterhead, threat letters, surveillance notes. To Colleen, this wasn't just kidnapping. It was survival in a world she no longer understood. Janice Hooker, Cameron's wife, had always been the quiet accomplice. She had made a deal with Cameron. She'd let him take a sex slave as long as he didn't touch her anymore. But now Janice was starting to see the cracks. Colleen wasn't just a side project. She was becoming the center of Cameron's life. Worse, Cameron was talking about building a soundproof dungeon under the house. Something permanent. He was obsessed. Janice started to wonder. What happens when he gets bored with Colleen? Would he find someone new? Would he kill Colleen? Would she, Janice, be next? One night, while Cameron was away, Janice opened the box. Colleen blinked at her, barely able to speak. Janice gave her water. And for the first time, she told her the truth. There was no company. It was all Cameron. A lie. A myth. A mental cage. Colleen broke down. But she didn't scream. Didn't run. Because she didn't believe her. Not yet. As time went on, Colleen was allowed out of the box more often. Cameron wanted her to prove loyalty. He let her do chores. Clean. Care for the baby. He even gave her a Bible and told her to pray. Colleen began to regain fragments of herself. Her mind flickered back to normal life. Books. Memories. Her family. Her name. But then, in the far corner of the house, she found something that made her blood freeze. A pile of wood. Chains. Hooks. Drawings of a second box. There was going to be another girl. Cameron began talking about expanding. He said Colleen would help train the next girl. She would teach her how to obey, how to endure. Colleen felt sick. In her twisted, brainwashed world, she had accepted her fate. But to watch someone else go through it? To be part of it? That was the line she couldn't cross. The company might not be real. But Cameron was. And now she was afraid of him in a whole new way. One morning, Cameron gave her a gift. He let her call her family. Her mother answered. Colleen told her she was safe. That she was happy. That she had joined a religious group and wasn't allowed to say where she was. Her mother cried with joy. She believed it. But behind that calm voice, Colleen was screaming inside. Screaming through a phone line across miles from inside a prison with no bars. No one heard her. Not yet. Janice was unraveling. She had lived in denial for years. She had obeyed. Submitted. But Colleen was becoming more human to her. More real. They prayed together. Whispered. And one night, Janice promised her something. I'm going to help you leave. But Colleen had heard promises before. And she wasn't sure if this was just another test. Still, it was the first time in years she dared think the word. Escape. In the stillness under that bed, Colleen waited. Not for food. Not for light. Not for mercy. She waited for a signal. Because something was changing in that house. Cameron's control was slipping. Janice's guilt was boiling over. And Colleen? She was starting to remember who she used to be. A daughter. A sister. A person. The cracks in the walls weren't just in her mind anymore. They were real. And they were spreading. What makes someone surrender their freedom? For Colleen Stan, it wasn't chains. It wasn't the box. It wasn't even the fear of death. It was belief. Belief in something terrifying, something invisible. The company. The secret organization Cameron Hooker said owned her. He didn't need to lock her in a room anymore. She had become her own prison. And now he was going to test just how loyal she'd become. It was early 1981, 4 years after Colleen had disappeared. Cameron had begun to trust her more. He let her out of the box for longer hours. Gave her books. Let her cook, clean, care for the baby. Colleen was even allowed to go outside, in disguise, of course. Neighbors sometimes waved. No one suspected a thing. To the world, she was just a quiet housemaid. To Cameron, she was something more. He called her his slave wife now, and he wanted to make it official. He gave her a name. K, short for K. He made her sign another contract. This one wasn't forged. This one was real. In a twisted mock ceremony, Cameron performed what he called a binding ritual. Colleen knelt, hands tied, blindfolded. She wore a chain collar. Cameron read vows, promises of ownership, submission, and punishment. Janice watched, silent, expressionless. At the end, Cameron kissed her forehead and said, "You belong to me now, in body and soul, forever." Colleen didn't resist. She believed this was survival. But in the back of her mind, the word forever started to echo like a curse. Cameron wasn't satisfied. He began planning for a second slave. He told Colleen she would help him train the new girl, that she had earned a promotion. He even built a second box, deeper, colder, more advanced. That's when it hit Colleen. If another girl came, she'd be Cameron's favorite. And Colleen? She'd become replaceable. Which meant she might not survive much longer. Janice had always lived in Cameron's shadow. She married him when she was just 15. He groomed her, manipulated her, broke her. She had watched him abuse Colleen for years. But now he was crossing a line. He talked about making Colleen his legal wife. Janice would be cast aside. She wasn't afraid for Colleen anymore. She was afraid for herself. The loyalty she'd clung to for so long started to twist into something else. Jealousy, rage, guilt, and then she snapped. Janice took Colleen aside in the kitchen while Cameron was at work. Her voice was shaking. She said, "There's no company. There never was. It was all Cameron. I'm sorry. I let it happen." Colleen didn't cry, didn't speak. She just stared. Then Janice said the words that cracked the last of the illusion. "You're free." Colleen stepped back. For years, she dreamed of escape. Now that the door was open, her legs wouldn't move. It wasn't dramatic. There was no running, no chase, no screaming. Colleen picked up her things. She left the house. She walked to a bus station. Janice gave her money and told her not to tell anyone, not yet. And for some reason, Colleen listened. She took a bus 400 miles away to her family. And when her mother opened the door, she nearly collapsed. Her daughter had come home, but she had brought something with her, something invisible. 7 years of silence. It's the question everyone asks. Why didn't Colleen escape earlier? Why didn't she scream when she had the chance? The answer is simple and horrifying. Psychological captivity is just as real as physical captivity. Colleen's mind had been twisted into submission. She wasn't just a prisoner, she believed in the walls around her. Cameron's greatest weapon wasn't violence. It was belief. And now that belief had shattered. But justice? That was still far away. Colleen stayed quiet for months. She didn't tell the police. She didn't go public. But inside her, something was burning. When she found out Cameron was still living with Janice, still raising a daughter, still pretending to be normal, she couldn't stay silent any longer. Colleen made the call. Not to the company. To the police. And everything began to unravel. Cameron Hooker was arrested in 1984. He denied everything. Said Colleen had been a willing participant. Janice? She turned on him. She agreed to testify in exchange for full immunity. She described everything. The box. The contract. The hooks. The plan for another girl. It was one of the most disturbing testimonies in California history. Cameron sat silently in the courtroom. The same way Colleen had sat silently in the box for 7 years. The trial of Cameron Hooker would shock the world. The press called it the girl in the box case. Psychologists called it one of the most extreme examples of coercive control ever seen. But what happened after the trial? To Janice? To Colleen? To the little girl in the house who saw it all? And the biggest question of all. Where's Cameron Hooker now? The story isn't over. Not yet. For 7 years, Colleen Stan lived in a box. And for 7 years, she believed that a secret organization, the company, was watching her every move. They would punish her if she stepped out of line. Kill her family if she escaped. Destroy everything she loved. But now she knew the truth. There was no company. There was only Cameron Hooker. and he was finally on trial. But when the doors of the courtroom opened, she realized this nightmare was far from over. It was March 1985 when the People vs. Cameron Hooker began. Red Bluff, California had never seen anything like it. The courtroom overflowed with press, sketch artists, and stunned locals. People couldn't believe something this dark had happened in their quiet town. Colleen sat at the front, facing the man who had once been her god, her captor, her devil. Cameron Hooker wore a suit. He looked mild, unthreatening. He smiled at the jury. And when asked how he pled, not guilty. Cameron's defense was bold and sickening. He claimed everything had been consensual, that Colleen had willingly submitted to a BDSM relationship, that she had never been kept against her will. He even had pictures of Colleen tied up, smiling. Photos he had staged, manipulated. His lawyer called it a lifestyle, said Colleen was embarrassed now and trying to rewrite the past. Some of the jury squirmed. Doubt flickered. But then, Janice took the stand. Janice Hooker had immunity in exchange for her testimony. She sat in the witness box, pale and trembling, and told the court everything. How Cameron had kidnapped Colleen. How he built the box. How he used fear, isolation, and lies to control her. How he hung her from the ceiling. How he planned to take more girls. She confessed her own complicity. Said she once saw Colleen's body hanging, limp, and did nothing. And when asked why she didn't leave Cameron sooner, Janice said, "Because he made me believe I couldn't." As the trial progressed, the jury was shown the box. Yes, that box. The same one Colleen had lived in for years. It was brought into the courtroom, placed at the center like a coffin. Jurors were allowed to inspect it. One woman had to leave the room. Inside, the temperature rose rapidly. The air was stale. No light, no sound. Even just minutes inside made some feel dizzy. Colleen lived there for years. The jurors didn't forget that. When Colleen took the stand, the room fell silent. She described in calm, haunting detail what life in the box was like. How she survived. How she forgot how to cry. How she trained herself not to scream. But more chilling than her words was her composure. There was no rage, no breakdown, only hollow strength. A woman who had already survived hell and was now simply walking others through it. She ended with, "He didn't just keep me in a box. He built one around my mind." After 33 days of testimony, the jury deliberated. When they returned, the judge asked, "Have you reached a verdict?" "Yes, Your Honor." Cameron Hooker was found guilty on all counts: kidnapping, sexual assault, torture, and using a deadly weapon during the commission of a felony. His sentence? 104 years in prison. No parole. No release. The boxmaker had been locked inside one. Janice Hooker, despite her testimony, walked free. Many criticized the immunity deal. She had allowed the abuse to continue for years. But prosecutors said they never would have convicted Cameron without her. Janice disappeared from public life. Some say she changed her name, moved states, became a born-again Christian. But her past and what she watched happen never disappeared. She knew that. Colleen tried to go back to normal. She found work, started counseling, spoke to schools and trauma survivors. But even years later, she never slept with the door closed. She flinched at loud noises. She didn't trust kindness easily. She said the worst part wasn't the box. It was the time. The wasted years. "I lost myself," she once said. "And then I had to find someone new." Just when she thought it was over. 1 year after the trial, Colleen received a letter in the mail. No return address. No signature. Just a single sentence typed on white paper. "You still belong to me." She dropped it. Froze. Called the police. They ran handwriting and fingerprint tests. Nothing. Was it Cameron? A copycat? Janice? They never found out. But Colleen changed her number. Moved again. The past had knocked once more. And though the door stayed shut, the sound never left her head. It's easy to believe horror stories have endings. That the monster goes to jail. The survivor moves on. The book closes. But trauma doesn't work like that. Sometimes the scariest part isn't what happens during the nightmare. It's what stays behind after. There are parts of the story that never made it into the courtroom. Moments too graphic, too unsettling, too dark. But they happened. And they mattered. Because they show what kind of monster Colleen Stan was up against. He didn't just want control. He wanted to make her believe she was never human to begin with. And to do that, he hung her from a hook in the ceiling. The room was small, cold, soundproofed. In the center, a steel hook anchored to the ceiling beam. This was where Cameron performed what he called training. He stripped Colleen naked, bound her wrists, then hoisted her by the arms. Until her feet no longer touched the floor, she would dangle for hours. The circulation in her hands would cut off. Her joints would scream. Her skin would swell. He would leave her there and watch. Sometimes he would hurt her. Other times he would just wait to see how long she could endure it, to see when she would break. After weeks of isolation, silence, and starvation, Cameron presented her with a document. Typed, formal, legal-looking, a slave contract. It stated, Colleen was no longer a person. She was owned by Cameron. Her body, mind, and future belonged to him. She would obey without question. Disobedience meant punishment or death by the company. He made her sign it. Shaking, broken, terrified. She did, not because she agreed, but because she believed it was already true. In one corner of the basement, Cameron had built a table. It wasn't for eating, or working, or sitting. It was for displaying. He would bind Colleen to it, arms spread, legs apart, eyes blindfolded. He never told her what would happen next. That was part of the torture. Sometimes he'd leave her there for hours in silence. Sometimes he wouldn't. He wanted her to live on the edge of terror, constantly unsure. She later said, the worst part wasn't the pain. It was not knowing when it would come. Cameron had rules. Not laws. Not requests. Rules. Colleen had to ask permission to speak. She could not look him in the eyes. She had to refer to him as master. She had to thank him after every punishment. She was never to make noise in the box. She could only eat when told. She could only cry when allowed. Breaking the rules meant punishment, but following them? That meant survival. And so she followed them. Every single one. Cameron believed in behavioral control, like a zookeeper or a cult leader. If Colleen followed instructions perfectly, she would be rewarded. Once he gave her a second blanket in the box. Another time he let her sleep outside the box for one night, chained, of course. The biggest reward? Books. He let her read old novels, religious texts, dictionaries. Words became her escape. She started to remember who she was at. Not just a body, but a person with a name, even if she couldn't say it out loud. While Cameron was torturing Colleen, Janice was watching. At first, she believed she was part of the system. Cameron had promised her, this will make our marriage stronger. This is just for now. You're still my wife. But slowly, Janice began to realize something horrifying. She wasn't the partner. She was the audience. Cameron didn't want two women. He wanted one prisoner and one enabler. And Janice was playing both roles. Their daughter was growing up in that house, sleeping above the box, walking past the locked rooms. She didn't know the truth. Not fully, but sometimes she heard sounds. Sometimes she asked questions. And sometimes, Colleen held her, fed her, changed her, because while her own life was in chains, she still knew how to care. It was one of the only things that kept her sane. A child who had no idea she was being raised in a house built on horror. After Colleen's first few months, the box was modified. More padding, less airflow, no light at all. Cameron called it perfecting the design. She was kept in there 23 hours a day for nearly 3 years straight. She developed muscle atrophy. Her vision blurred in light. She lost her sense of time. Sometimes she forgot words, forgot her birthday, forgot her own face. Once she said, I didn't know if I was alive or already dead. And that's exactly where Cameron wanted her. This wasn't a man looking for lust. This was a man building a machine of obedience. And Colleen, intelligent, warm, full of life, had become its prisoner. But inside the box, inside her mind, something still pulsed. A tiny spark. Not rage, not revenge. Hope. And it would come from the most unexpected person of all. The one who helped put her there. Colleen Stan had survived the unimaginable. 7 years of captivity. A coffin-sized box beneath a bed. Chains. Torture. Psychological control. And just as she began to believe her nightmare might end, Cameron Hooker gave her a new job. He said she had earned it. Said she had proven herself. Said it was time for her to move up. He wanted her to help him train the next girl. Cameron no longer locked Colleen in the box every day. She was obedient now. Loyal. She cooked, cleaned, bathed, prayed, all under his supervision. Now he told her he wanted to expand. He would kidnap another girl, raise her the same way, condition her just like Colleen had been. And Colleen? You'll show her the rules. Teach her to behave. You'll break her in. He said it like it was a promotion. But to Colleen, it sounded like a death sentence. Not for her body, but for her soul. Cameron went back to his workshop. He started building again. Sawing, hammering, measuring. The second box was bigger, better insulated, with new restraints, a more efficient ventilation system. He bragged about the improvements. Said the new girl would be easier to train. That Colleen had taken too long. She listened in silence. But inside, something was screaming. If he brought in another girl, Colleen would become disposable. Or worse, become part of the machine. One day, Cameron came home from work, eyes wide. He told Colleen he'd seen a girl at a bus stop. Alone. Young. Pretty. He said she was perfect. Said he'd follow her routine. Plan the abduction. Colleen nodded. She didn't ask questions. Didn't protest. Because that's what he expected. But something had changed. Not in her fear, but in her silence. She was no longer obedient. She was waiting. That night, Colleen found Janice in the kitchen, staring into a sink of dirty water. Her hands were shaking. She looked tired. Broken. Janice whispered, "He's serious, isn't he?" Colleen didn't answer. She didn't need to. Janice started crying. She said she thought it was just a fantasy. That Cameron would never do it again. That Colleen had been the only one. She was wrong. Now she had a choice. Stop him, or let him destroy another life. Colleen and Janice sat on the floor in the basement. For the first time in 7 years, they spoke freely. Janice admitted she had wanted to leave for years. But Cameron always pulled her back in. With threats, guilt, religion, lies. Colleen told her about the girl at the bus stop, about the plans, about the new box. Then Colleen said, "He'll kill her, and then maybe us." Janice nodded. They made a pact that night. One of them would get out. One of them would tell the truth. Cameron started designing more than just boxes. He kept a journal filled with drawings of dungeons, cages, restraints. He wrote stories about women in chains, scripts, dialogue, names. He called it his project of perfection. He said he would have multiple girls eventually, all living underground, rotating through punishment and training. He even said he'd let Colleen help choose them. Colleen said nothing, but in her head she was memorizing every detail. Every word would become evidence. In a shocking turn, Cameron started bringing Colleen to church. Yes, in public. She wore a long dress, sunglasses, sat quietly, spoke to no one. To the congregation, she looked shy, religious, submissive. To Colleen, it was a test, a leash disguised as a gift. If she ran, the company would kill her family. If she spoke, Cameron would punish her. But she started to notice something. People were kind, friendly, unafraid, and the thought returned. What if none of it's real? What if the company never existed? Janice became distant, withdrawn, quiet, avoiding Cameron. He noticed. One night he confronted her. She told him she was having doubts, that she didn't want another girl, that Colleen had served her purpose. Cameron grew furious, said Janice was disobedient, said he could replace her too. That was the turning point. Janice realized she wasn't the wife, she was just another prisoner, and she wasn't going to wait for her own box. Janice snuck Colleen a stack of bills. Enough for a bus ticket. She told her, "Pack when he's gone. Don't tell anyone. I'll cover for you." Colleen hesitated. The fear of the company was still alive in her mind, still crawling through her thoughts. But then she saw the new box nearly finished, with a thick steel latch, and she made a decision. She would not train the next girl, because there would be no next girl. Sometimes a rescue isn't loud. It's not dramatic. There are no sirens, no SWAT teams. Sometimes escape is a whisper, a quiet look between two women who finally refuse to be silent. And just like that, the door was open, and Colleen was stepping through it. Colleen Stan escaped. She stepped out the door, got on a bus, left the house where she'd been imprisoned for 7 years. But freedom isn't clean. It doesn't arrive with peace. Sometimes when you've been broken for that long, your captor comes with you. Not in chains, not in the flesh, but in the mind. Colleen sat at the back of the Greyhound bus, her body pressed to the window, eyes scanning the highway. She expected to see men in black cars, surveillance vans, someone following her. The company she thought would never let her go. Every time the bus stopped, her heart pounded. Every new passenger? A potential assassin. But no one came. And that was worse, because it meant something she was afraid to believe. The company wasn't real. Colleen arrived at her parents' home. They cried when they saw her, held her like a child. She hadn't been seen in 7 years. They thought she was dead, or in a cult, or somewhere lost in the world. But when she hugged her mother, Colleen didn't feel relief. She felt guilt, because deep down she knew she could have come home earlier. Colleen didn't tell them the full truth, not right away. How do you explain being in prison when you looked free? How do you tell someone you went back to your abuser voluntarily? They didn't understand. No one did. Her friends asked, "Why didn't you run? Why didn't you scream at church? Why didn't you tell us when you visited?" Colleen had no easy answer. Only this: because I believed I wasn't allowed to. Colleen began to notice things. She couldn't sleep unless the lights were on. She couldn't shower with the door closed. She panicked when someone stood behind her. Every knock on the door sent chills down her spine. Her body was free, but her thoughts weren't. Sometimes she heard Cameron's voice in her head. "You belong to me. They're watching. This isn't over." She closed her eyes, whispered to herself, "It's not real. It's not real." But it felt real. Every time. 2 weeks after Colleen escaped, she received a call from Janice, the woman who had helped her leave, the wife of the man who broke her. Janice said she was sorry, said she was going to the police, said she couldn't live with it anymore. She asked Colleen not to talk yet. "Let me handle it," she said. And Colleen agreed. Still afraid, still unsure, still conditioned. Colleen tried to return to normal life. She got a job, started therapy, kept to herself. But every day was like walking a tightrope over her past. She'd look at crowds and wonder how many people were living in secret cages. She'd hear laughter and feel like she didn't deserve it. She still kept Cameron's rules. Not out of fear anymore. Out of habit. One day, Colleen passed a newsstand. A headline caught her eye. "Wife turns in husband in torture case, woman kept in coffin under bed for 7 years." Her stomach dropped. It was her story. Her face. Her nightmare, now public. That same day, reporters started calling her home. Victim advocates, producers, publishers. Everyone wanted to know. What was it like in the box? Why did you stay? Are you okay now? Colleen hung up every time. Because she wasn't ready. She was barely even whole. Weeks later, Colleen's mother brought in the mail. One envelope had no return address. Inside, a single piece of paper. Typed. It read, "You still belong to me." Colleen dropped it. Froze. It had no signature. No fingerprints. Police couldn't trace it. Couldn't confirm if Cameron had sent it. He was already in custody. Which meant 2 possibilities. Either someone was pretending, or Cameron still had reach. Either way, Colleen felt the old fear crawl back in. The walls she had escaped were closing in again. Colleen's therapist sat across from her during a quiet session. She said, "Colleen, what happened to you wasn't just physical captivity. It was coercive control. You were conditioned like a soldier, like a cult member. But that's not your fault. That's his. You survived it." Colleen nodded. But she didn't cry. She didn't scream. She whispered, "Then why do I still feel like I'm in the box?" The therapist replied, "Because no one ever taught you how to leave it. Sometimes the scariest part of horror isn't the monster. It's what the monster leaves behind. The invisible hand on your shoulder. The voice in your head. The rules you still follow." Colleen Stan escaped. But survival is not the end. It's the next prison. And to break out of it, she'll have to face the one person she hasn't yet. Herself. 7 years. That's how long Colleen Stan endured her nightmare. A wooden box. Chains. Isolation. Mind control. But even in that hell, there was a moment she still remembers as the lowest point. Not because of what was done to her, but because of what she felt when it ended. Nothing. Cameron had rules. Schedules. Systems. Colleen had learned them all: how to stay out of trouble, how to avoid pain, how to shrink herself into silence. But one day, something went wrong. It wasn't big. Just a dish not washed right. Or maybe she didn't speak quickly enough. Cameron didn't yell. He just stared at her and said, "It's time for a reminder." He brought her to the basement, laid her down on the table, the one with the straps. He chained her arms and legs tight. Then he placed something beside her. A razor blade. He didn't use it. He just let it sit there. And then he said, "Do you know what happens to broken slaves?" She didn't answer. They get replaced. He didn't hurt her that day, not physically. Instead, he left her on the table. 4 hours. No food. No water. No movement. The light overhead buzzed. She heard the hum of the pipes. The creak of footsteps upstairs. She didn't know if it was day or night. Time stopped meaning anything. At one point, she stopped caring if she lived or died. Cameron returned hours later, said he was running a test. He blindfolded her, placed a bag over her head, cut off nearly all airflow. He told her, "The company wants to know how strong you are." She believed him. She always believed him. As the oxygen faded, her thoughts slowed. The world narrowed to heartbeats and static. Then nothing. Colleen lost consciousness. When she came to, she was back in the box. Alone, weak, confused. She thought she had died, that she was in hell. But hell would have been an escape. This was worse, because she was still alive, and she didn't know why. She later described that moment as feeling dead without a scratch. No blood, no bruises, just emptiness, like someone had reached inside her and flipped a switch. Hope off, fear off, identity off. She didn't cry, didn't scream, just lay in the dark, thinking, this is what it is. This is all it will ever be. And somehow, that acceptance made her stronger. Because when you stop fearing death, you stop obeying fear. Janice noticed it first. Colleen didn't flinch anymore, didn't ask permission to speak, didn't tremble when Cameron came into the room. She was quiet, still, watching, like a prisoner who had figured out the lock, but wasn't ready to open it yet. Janice felt something she hadn't in years. Unease, because if Colleen wasn't afraid anymore, what was she? Cameron grew more paranoid, started locking tools away, watching both women more closely. He told Janice, "She's changing. I don't like it." Janice didn't answer. She was changing too. The guilt had twisted into something new, conviction. She began praying again, not for forgiveness, but for courage. Because if Colleen gave up, she would have to fight for her, or live with it forever. Cameron tried to regain control. He put the collar back on Colleen, the chain, the gag, said he was retraining her. Colleen let him think she was broken again. But inside, something had shifted. She wasn't a slave anymore, not in her mind. Now she was a witness, an observer, a survivor preparing to speak. She watched his every move, every habit, every phrase, because when this was over, she was going to tell the world. Colleen didn't escape because someone broke down the door. She escaped because she let herself feel everything, then nothing, then something else, something her captor couldn't touch. Not obedience, not silence, but resolve. And from that moment on, the end was coming. Colleen Stan escaped. She came home, faced her fears, told her story. But she wasn't the only one who had lived in fear. As her name hit the headlines, her face on the news, others began to whisper, women, survivors, and suddenly Colleen realized she was never alone in that box. 3 months after the trial, Colleen received a letter in the mail. No threats this time, just handwriting, shaky, nervous. The letter read, "I saw your story. I think something similar happened to me in Oregon in 1975. I thought I imagined it. I didn't." The writer didn't give her full name, only initials, AH. She described being picked up while hitchhiking, by a man and a woman, with a baby in the back seat. Colleen felt her breath leave her body. The same setup, the same bait. Could it have been Cameron Hooker? More letters came. Women from across California, Oregon, Washington, all with similar stories. A man obsessed with control, the woman by his side, disappearances, strange encounters at gas stations and rural highways. Some had escaped, others had blacked it out. One letter simply said, "I never told anyone until now. Thank you for surviving." Colleen started keeping a folder. Each letter, one more reason to speak louder. Because this wasn't just her story anymore. It was a pattern. Colleen began looking into missing persons cases from the 70s and early 80s. She found one that haunted her. Marie Spanhake, age 19, disappeared in Chico, California, 1976. Last seen walking home after a trip to the laundromat. Witnesses claimed they saw her talking to a young couple in a blue car. Cameron and Janice Hooker lived in Chico in 1976. Janice had once hinted to investigators that Colleen wasn't the first, but she wouldn't confirm any names. Now, Colleen couldn't stop asking, what if Marie was the first girl in the box? In an interview years later, Janice confessed something chilling. She said that when Marie vanished, Cameron came home with blood on his shirt, that he told her, "She didn't make it. We'll try again." Some believed Marie had been buried near the Hookers' old home. Investigators searched. Dogs were brought in. Ground-penetrating radar. No remains were found. But in the basement, behind one wall, they discovered scratches. Dozens of them. And something else. A silver earring. Not Colleen's. Colleen started having dreams. Of the box. Of the hook. Of another girl's voice whispering. Why you? Why not me? Survivor's guilt set in hard. Why did she live when others didn't? She tried to tell herself. I helped put him away. I broke the cycle. But the truth? Cameron had plans for more girls. She'd just been the first to walk away. Colleen returned to Red Bluff 1 year after the trial. The house was still there. She parked down the street. Didn't go inside. Just stared at it. It looked normal. A coat of paint. A kid's bike in the yard. New owners probably unaware of what lay beneath their bedroom. She whispered, "There's a grave in there, even if no one died. Because for 7 years." She did, and came back different. Janice never publicly admitted to Marie's murder. Never said exactly how many girls Cameron tried to take. She disappeared after the trial. Changed her name. Joined a church. Refused all interviews. Colleen wrote her once. Not to forgive her. Not to accuse her. Just to say, "You helped me leave. That matters." She never got a reply. But she didn't need one. Some boxes stay sealed forever. One night, Colleen sat with a detective who had worked her case. He told her something that made her blood run cold. There are more men like him out there. We catch a few. Most we never even hear about. Colleen asked, "How many?" The detective just looked at her. Then said, "You don't want to know." But she did. Because she had a voice now. And some people never get to speak. Colleen wasn't the only one. And Cameron Hooker wasn't the only monster. But for every one of them, there might be someone just like Colleen. Not in chains. Not behind bars. But trapped in their mind. Following rules no one else can see. And sometimes all it takes is hearing one story to start asking questions of your own. Colleen Stan escaped in 1984. But what does freedom look like? When you've forgotten how to live? What happens to the monster in the story? Where do survivors go when the news cycle ends? And does the box ever really stay shut? This is the final chapter. The end of the beginning. In 1985, Cameron Hooker was sentenced to 104 years in prison. The judge called it one of the most depraved cases he had ever seen. There was no parole. No possibility of early release, at least not for decades. Cameron didn't show emotion in court. Didn't speak to Colleen. Never apologized. He went to Folsom State Prison, locked behind steel doors and razor wire. Colleen never saw him again. But he never really left her life. In 2021, over 3 decades later, Colleen got a phone call. It was from the California Department of Corrections. Cameron Hooker was being considered for parole. A change in sentencing laws meant he could be evaluated for good behavior. Colleen was stunned. How can someone who buried me in a box for 7 years be considered reformed? She spoke out publicly, filed a victim impact statement. The media picked the story up again. And in 2022, his parole was denied. He remains behind bars. But now every few years, she gets the call again. And every time, it's like being pulled back into the box. After the trial, Colleen tried to live quietly. She found work in a law office, helped raise her siblings' kids, avoided cameras, reporters, interviews. She never changed her name, never disappeared. She once said, "He took enough from me. I wasn't going to let him take my name too." But the healing was slow and incomplete. Some nights she'd wake up gasping, dreams of wood and foam and air running out. She'd sit in the light for hours, because the dark still reminded her who she used to be. In the 2000s, Colleen began speaking publicly. She gave talks on trauma, survival, and psychological abuse. People listened, because her story wasn't just about torture. It was about how a person can be controlled without handcuffs. She helped reshape how people understood coercive control long before it was common language. Victims of domestic abuse, women in cults, Even soldiers with PTSD came forward and said, "I didn't understand what happened to me until I heard your story." She made the invisible chains visible. In 2022, Netflix released a dramatized series called The Girl in the Picture, drawing parallels to Colleen's story. It wasn't about her directly, but the comparisons reignited interest. Producers reached out. Podcasts called. Books were offered. Colleen declined most of them. She didn't want fame. She wanted peace. But she did agree to one interview years later. In it, she was asked, "What would you say to Cameron if he could hear you now?" She paused, then said, "I would say nothing. He doesn't deserve my voice anymore." Janice Hooker disappeared after the trial. She was granted full immunity for her testimony. Never served a single day in jail. Some say she remarried. Others say she lives in a small religious community. But to this day, she's never spoken publicly about Marie Spanhake. Never clarified whether more victims existed. She remains a ghost, one who held the keys and waited too long to use them. The box Cameron built was burned in the late 80s. Police destroyed it after using it for training and court display. But blueprints still exist. Photos, dimensions. It became a symbol not just of physical captivity, but of what fear can build around a mind. It's used in law classes, psychological studies, training for abuse counselors. A twisted kind of legacy, built out of pain, but passed on as prevention. In her last public speech, Colleen stood before a quiet room. She wasn't loud, wasn't dramatic. She said, "I thought I'd never survive. I thought I was dead before I was rescued." But survival isn't about escaping. It's about unlearning. About realizing that the voice in your head isn't yours. It's his. And then one day it's gone. And you're finally alone with yourself. That's when healing begins. She received a standing ovation. But she didn't smile. She just nodded and walked off the stage. Today, Colleen lives quietly in California. She's in her 60s. No longer a victim. Not even just a survivor. She is a witness to what the human spirit can endure. To the evil people hide in plain sight. To what it means to rebuild, piece by piece, the self you were told didn't exist. She doesn't live in fear anymore. But she still keeps one light on at night. And no doors in her house ever lock from the outside. This was The Girl in the Box. A story of captivity. Of manipulation. Of trauma that walks beside you even when the cage is gone. But most of all, a story of escape. Not just from a box beneath the bed, but from a prison inside the mind.